Hello and welcome back to the Solio Analytics podcast. It's a Solio Analytics podcast this week. It's just me. Pras is away, so I'll be trying to fill in for him and serve both roles. It's my first time talking to myself rather than anyone else, so please forgive me if I get a bit lost or lost to my own thoughts. I'm sure I can talk to myself for 45 to 60 minutes quite easily, but we'll try and get everything covered. So just to timestamp this, I'm recording Wednesday evening after Arsenal have just beaten Chelsea in the League Cup semi-final. First leg, Man City beat Newcastle 2-0 in the first leg yesterday. So actually both the favourites, City and Arsenal, were kind of fairly heavy favourites coming into qualifying for the finals, but they've now both won away from home. So actually the chances of them qualifying for the finals are quite high. So that's where we are at the moment. Cole Palmer wasn't in the squad. Timber did play. He played at left back, but we'll get into that. So what we're going to try and cover today is I'll go through what these cup games that we've just had means for the potential blank game week, double game week slates for the rest of the season. I'll try and cover a little bit about blank game week 34 as well, which is the one that clashes with the FA Cup semi-finals. I've done a few simulations to get an early look at that, since there aren't really any market odds on who's going to make the semi-finals just yet, since we've only just had the third round last weekend. Did have a few upsets. We had, well, it depends what you call it. Well, Palace losing to Macclesfield was certainly an upset. I don't think the holders were expected to lose to 6th-tier team. But Manchester United are out, Nottingham Forest are out, Bournemouth are out, a few teams. So we'll cover that as well and just talk a bit about chip strategy and what you might want to do. Both what the landscape might look like when we get there, but what you might want to do in the meantime while we wait for more information. I'll also cover a little bit about some of the upcoming players you might be looking at. So obviously Chelsea is someone we might want to be investing in. They've just had a new manager. He's only had a couple of games with them. A star player, or at least the most expensive FPL player, still seems to have some injury issues. Is it worth going for Enzo over Palmer? Is it worth going for Rice over Saka, etc., etc.? And then we'll look a little bit at my team and what I'm looking to do with it. I'll also cover a little bit about early wildcard. If you have activated it already, or you're trying to hang on and you're trying to activate it soon, your team's in a mess and you want to play it soon, how do you navigate that? And I've also opened up the floor to a bit of a Q&A from some of our Discord members. So the Discord is open to everyone who uses Solio. You don't have to be a paying member. I'll put the link in the description, but we're all there, all the Solio members, some moderators. We've got, well, it's growing. There's a lot of people now. But there's just nice FPL chat. There's nice non-FPL chat. Lots of good suggestions about how we can improve the website and feature requests, and we keep people posted with things we're working on there. So I recommend you join, but also, should we do more of these Q&A sections, if it proves successful, then that's where to ask the questions. So to start with, let's go to the blank game week fixtures. So just as a header, I think the overview of it is that we are expecting, there's 2 game weeks that clash with cup games. So we know that game week 31 clashes with the League Cup final, and we know that game week 34 clashes with the FA Cup semi-finals. There's a potential small clash in game week 37, but it's very specific, because game week 37 has a free midweek after it, unless you're in the Europa League final. That's where that one sits. So I'll cover that in a bit more detail, but we're not expecting anything there. We could still have weather postponements, but those are much more unpredictable. I think once they've been postponed, we try and think about where they might go, but trying to predict which game might be called off is perhaps a fool's errand. But essentially, we've got quite an easy slate for this game week 31, in that we knew it was going to be Man City or Newcastle, which would cause a clash with Man City Palace or Newcastle Sunderland. Exactly one of those would have a clash depending on who won that semi-final. And we knew it was the same with Wolves Arsenal or Everton Chelsea. with Arsenal-Chelsea in the semi-final. And as I said at the start, Man City won 2-0 at St James's Park. Arsenal won 3-2 at Stamford Bridge. So both favourites. I think they were both about 70 to 75% pre-kickoff in their fixtures, are now above 90% likely to qualify if we take the sharp market odds from Pinnacle. So I think we're all but expecting Man City, Crystal Palace, and Wolves Arsenal to blank in Game Week 31. Strange things happen. Newcastle or Chelsea could stage a comeback. So I wouldn't rule it out, but it's certainly not something I'm looking to plan for too much. I think also they had more complicated reasons to be potentially brought forward in terms of Newcastle and Chelsea still being likely in for the playoffs for the Champions League, which is one of the spaces where we think Wolves Arsenal might go. So I'll just quickly hop over to the calendar and just show you where we are. So this is a sort of overview. I've not put the actual fixtures in. I've actually just put which competition the fixtures are in here, and I'll try and describe it for audio listeners. But this is up to game week. Well, I've got the whole season, but up to game week 31 here. So this is the week where we have the FPL Cup final, and actually there's a few midweeks before it. So we have these are the last 16s, so we can't bring it forward to there because quite likely that Arsenal or Chelsea or Man City or Newcastle or Palace in the Conference League might make these last 16s, but we do have a bit of space. We don't have space earlier over here. This is like Champions League and Europa League, the second leg of the semi-finals. And then we've got 2 Premier League rounds of fixtures. So this is the weekend here, this sort of first column. And then this is the midweek afterwards. So we've got 25 and 26 back to back. So there's no space to double in 25. There is space in this week here. So I've got Wolves Arsenal might come through into this one. Because there is space, because Arsenal are all but guaranteed top 8 in the Champions League, so they wouldn't have this playoff round. We know that Palace are locked in; they're already in the playoff round. Chelsea might be, Liverpool might be, City might be, Newcastle might be, Forest might be in the Europa League. I think Aston Villa all but through in the top 8 in the Europa League, and Tottenham might be as well. But these aren't the ones that are relevant for these clashes. So this Wolves Arsenal one can come forward to here, which is what we saw last year. With the Aston Villa Liverpool game was announced, but we got a provisional announcement for this, and we got that after, I think it was just after Spurs had secured top 8 in the Europa League, because they were close for that one. But once Spurs had secured top 8, we knew that Spurs didn't have their 2 games here. Spurs were playing Liverpool, so if Spurs made the League Cup final, then their Spurs Fulham game could come forward. So they provisionally announced if Spurs win, Spurs Fulham comes forward to this week. I think it was game week 25, but it was the same sort of week in terms of the order of the fixtures. If not, Liverpool will win and Villa Liverpool will come forward. And they also announced that Arsenal Chelsea would come forward if Arsenal beat Newcastle. So this is last season's fixtures. They didn't announce Newcastle Palace to come forward because neither team were in Europe. There was much less pressure to bring it forward. Whereas Arsenal are still in Europe, they looking to do quite well in the Champions League. So actually they're likely to have fewer free midweeks later on in the season. If there's a free midweek here, we think they might try and bring it forward. They actually might have top 8 secured next week by the sort of match day 7 fixture. But they might want to wait for game week 30. Wait until game week 23 has happened for match day 8 to see whether Chelsea and Newcastle have made the top 8 or not, so that they can announce the provisional fixture movements altogether. Whereas last year we saw that they just left Newcastle Palace. They didn't announce it till later, and they put it later on in the week. So essentially that's where they might go in terms of where the fixtures go. So otherwise, Man City Palace, as we saw, didn't have the space. So that's likely to go for later on in the season. Double game week 33 is where it's sort of most likely to go, but there's a few spaces where it might go, and I'll cover those in a second. But that's our blank game week 31. So So in terms of planning for your teams coming up soon, then there's not a huge amount. I think most people are on triple Arsenal anyway. The Wolves assets would have a double game week of wouldn't be anyone too good. It's the Wolves assets would have a double game week of Forest away and Arsenal at home. And Arsenal would have a double game week of Brentford and Wolves. So since Wolves Arsenal is sort of 91% likely to be the blank in 31, you're probably looking at 50 to 70% likely that they bring it forward, but we'll get more info in game week 23 or 24 as to whether they do the provisional announcement, because that still gives them 2.5 weeks of leeway for them to make the announcement. They're not going to wait until game week 26 and say, it's on in a week. Whereas City Palace is probably about that likely to go into 33. 31 might be one people want to dead end or free hit in. I think traditionally with these two blanks are then two specific doubles and maybe a smaller double like the Wolves Arsenal one. Then people tend to either free hit in the first blank and then quote dead end the second blank. So they'll free hit 31 and wildcard in 35 here. So in game week 34, you use all your transfers to sell the players who aren't playing in 34 because a lot of them might have doubled in 33, and then you wildcard back into a team that makes sense for the run-in and actually get double game week 36. And you free hit 31. So if the ones who blank, so Arsenal, if they blank here, if they then don't blank in 34, you might want to hold on to them and not sell them in game week 31. So you could free hit in 31, hold them through. Same with the City players. Or conversely, you can do it the other way around. So you dead end into 32, you sell all your players who don't play, you sell all the Arsenal players, City players in game week 31, wildcard them back in 32, and then you free hit them out again in game week 34. So it kind of depends on who's overlapping with the fixtures. But I think as we get a bit closer, it'll be more apparent. So I think for now, the main thing to do is to kind of just make sure you're on the right Arsenal triple up. Or if you haven't got the third one, then you've got no real reason not to invest because they're likely to get a double game week beforehand. Not necessarily, but even then, they're looking good and the blank's not for quite a few weeks away. What I've done for the other blank, actually, is I'll go to blank game week 34. So this is... I'll show you the calendar first. So this is this blank game week here. So this is the one that overlaps with the FA Cup semi-finals. So we can see that actually this is a big international break here. And then we've got the FA Cup quarterfinals. So this is where we get a lot of info. This is sort of the tail end of the season. This is where people will be wildcarding maybe here. And they'll see game week 32. They'll see that game week 33 has a space. So that might be where Man City Palace has come forward from game week 31, or Newcastle, Everton, Chelsea, or Newcastle, Sunderland. If they pull off a comeback, they can probably come through. Or what we saw last season is we saw two of the game week 34 games come back into game week 33. So I think I've forgotten who was playing, but it was City and Arsenal had their fixtures brought forward. We actually had Brentford Forest pushed from game week 34 to still within game week 34, where it got pushed in the midweek. And actually, I think it was played on the Thursday. I think game week 35 started on the Friday, so it was a little confusing for some people, but it stayed within the same FPL game week. And they played their cup game on the Sunday, and they played in the league against Forest on the... Brentford played Forest on the Thursday. So actually, sorry, one last thing to cover. The reason that actually there's space here in game week 27 as well, this is a sort of a mirror of this 26 one. The reason that we think Wolves Arsenal won't go into that one is because Wolves play Aston Villa on the Friday. We have the TV picks for game week 28, and Wolves play Villa on the Friday, so that wouldn't leave enough space really for the games to be played in the Premier League weekend, and then Wolves and Arsenal to play midweek on the Wednesday or the Thursday, to then play on the Friday. You'd have to go both of them on the Saturday this week, which has already been picked. They're not doing that. One of them on the Tuesday, then the Friday. The only way that could move is if Villa drop all the way down to the playoffs for Conference League, because then they would have their Europa League the Europa League playoffs, they'd have their Europa League playoff here and here, and that would mean that Wolves Villa would have to move to the Sunday, which they've provisionally announced. If Villa are in the playoffs, then Wolves Villa will move to the Sunday, which would then leave space for Wolves Arsenal to come forward into the Wednesday or the Thursday. But as such, Game Week 26 is free. It's actually kind of a weird one. You'd have, I think Arsenal play Wigan in the FA Cup round for either side, or in the middle of their double game week. And Wolves would have their FA Cup round 4 in the middle as well. But that's why we think it doesn't go into 27. But Game Week 34, then these ones, there's actually none of them have been confirmed in 34. What we needed to have was, see Arsenal playing Newcastle. If Arsenal and Newcastle had both lost in the third round of the FA Cup, then we would know that this fixture is on in 34. So a few of them, so for example, West Ham, Everton, and Wolves, Tottenham, then Everton and Tottenham have both been knocked out. So in order for this to be a clash, West Ham would have to make the semi-finals. And there's no like kind of West Ham or the other team because the other team is knocked out. So maybe a fixture like Fulham, Villa. Fulham or Villa have to make it. They don't both have to make it, but one of them will have to make it to go to clash. So maybe neither one is super highly likely. But because there's a chance that either of them can make it, whereas West Ham and Wolves are relying on just West Ham or Wolves to make it. So those ones are quite unlikely. So as we go through each FA Cup round, we've got FA Cup round 4 between Game Week 26 and 27. So going into Game Week 27, we might have a few Game Week 34 fixtures confirmed. After the FA Cup round 5, we should have a few more confirmed. And actually, if we get FA Cup round 5 and we get a specific draw for the quarterfinals, so let's say Arsenal and Newcastle both win their round 5 games and draw each other in the quarterfinals, then we know exactly one of them makes the FA Cup semi-finals. So we know that Arsenal Newcastle is a blank early. We'd know that as soon as Game Week 30, Game Week 29 to 30. So we'll be getting a lot more info on these each round. So at the minute, any of them could be a blank, and any specific one is not super likely. But what I have done is I have simulated the FA Cup. So this is using our Solio Analytics team strengths for the Premier League teams, and then some inferred team strengths for the non-Premier League teams competing against them based on some of the sort of market odds from the last round on how teams around their position were rated against our Premier League teams. So this will slightly maybe overrate some of the Premier League teams in the earlier rounds because as we see, well, I mean, Man City fielded pretty strong lineup, but we'll see that the Premier League teams won't always field their strongest lineup that they might in the Premier League if they're playing a weaker team. So this would slightly overrate a Premier League team's chances compared to something that, we'll get market odds coming out for these in the near future, but the games are too far away for them to be pricing them. So this is just to sort of get a first feel. But as you can, what we've got here is all the teams could, all the fixtures could be blank, ranging from 12% for Wolves Tottenham up to 74% for Arsenal Newcastle. So these two fixtures at the top, Arsenal Newcastle, Burnley Man City, are probably the two most likely. They were probably the two most likely beforehand anyway, maybe Brighton Chelsea. Because Arsenal and Newcastle are both quite strong teams. They're both through. Newcastle have got a tough draw against Villa. So maybe their chances are reduced slightly. But then Burnley and Man City are both in. Brighton and Chelsea are both in. So those four are all quite high because it only needs one of them to reach the semi-finals. Liverpool Palace is then in at 35%. I think I'd maybe in your head you can sort of round these to the nearest maybe 10% because they're not going to be. It's more to get a ballpark figure of, Arsenal Newcastle is quite likely to be a blank from here. We'd need a few upsets for neither of them to make the semis. Whereas Wolves Tottenham is quite unlikely. We'd need Wolves to make it all the way to the semis, which can happen, but we're not expecting it necessarily. It's more to get us kind of a magnitude and an order feel before, we've had round 3. We've still got several rounds to go. But Liverpool Palace, we can see, for example, Crystal Palace knocked out against Macclesfield. But that's ranking about the same as this Fulham Villa game, because Liverpool are quite a strong team. Maybe haven't been performing quite as well as they would have liked to recently, but they're still very good. And Villa are doing very well, but maybe that means that they can't compete on all fronts. They've still got Europa League to contend for. They've still got Premier League title race, maybe, who knows. But they've also got a tough draw in the next round, playing Newcastle, or tougher draw than a Macclesfield. So yeah, and then we've got these teams as well afterwards. We've got Man United, Brentford, Bournemouth, Leeds, Sunderland, Forest, West Ham, Everton, Wolves, Tottenham have all got one of the teams knocked out, and the team that's remaining is not the strongest team. Sort of like lower mid table, some of the relegation teams in the Premier League. So those are all individually quite unlikely, but it's quite plausible we get one of them. We saw, Palace won the whole competition last year. Forest made it very far. I know they were doing well in Prem as well, but we do see these kind of teams go on a bit of a run. And then to get a bit more of a feel as well, I've worked out which are the most likely specific combos of blanks. So these are the fixtures so I've put clashes here because I've put clashes on the right hand side because there's as we saw with Forest Brentford, there are some fixtures that could just go back into that game week 34 midweek. So Bournemouth Leeds, for example, is a fixture that doesn't have any two teams in Europe. They might want to move it for TV reasons to one of the free midweeks in 33 or 36, but they could move it into 34 and stay there. They could move it into game week 35. Again, we'll get more idea of that as the TV picks come out for the Premier League round. So we'll see whether there's something like this Wolves Villa game in game week 28 that then blocks a specific fixture in game week 27. So that's why often the fixture people are trying to work out. They're waiting for the TV picks for each weekend round because that can give us clues as well. But essentially, the likeliest individual outcome is about 5% likely at most. I think that's probably a slight overestimate. So that would be Newcastle, Arsenal, Burnley, Man City, and Brighton, Chelsea being the blanks. But what we can see from the projected number of clashes on the right-hand side, that 3 or 4 clashes is probably what we're expecting. So the reason it might not be 4 is that if 4 Premier League teams make it to the semi-finals, then we might get Newcastle and Arsenal, or Brighton and Chelsea. So actually 2 teams make it, but they each cause the same blank. So that would give us 3 blanks instead of 4. Or you might get a non-Premier League team making it. So a Birmingham or a Wrexham or one of the Macclesfield as well, any of them. We do sometimes see them make it into the latter stages, so they wouldn't cause a Premier League blank. And actually, that's the same reason you could get 2. So 2 blanks, we've only got about 10% likely. Gives us an average number of clashes of 3.3, so 3 or 4 probably. For the same reason, you might get a non-Premier League team into the semis, but then you also get 2 teams from the same game week 34 fixture. So we might get, say, Newcastle, Arsenal, Man City, and Birmingham as the is when we might get Newcastle, Arsenal, Man City, and Macclesfield as the 4. In which case we'd have 2 blanks, even though there's 3 Premier League teams. There's a small chance, of getting 1 blank. I think one of the simulations had no blanks whatsoever, which was essentially 4 non-Premier League teams make the semis. The chance of no blank gamings is slightly higher because you might get Leeds making the semi-finals as the only Premier League team, and Bournemouth Leeds stays in the same midweek, for example. So these are quite up in the air, but it was just to give people a bit of a flavour of where they might go and where which blanks we might see in this probably bigger blank. So we're expecting 2 blanks in game week 31. So this would be 3 or 4 blanks in game week 34, probably. But any individual pairing is quite. Newcastle Arsenal is the one that stands out because Arsenal are doing very well. Newcastle are still quite a strong team. But in terms of where these ones might go, so this is something that was sort of slightly estimating from here. But obviously, game week 33 and game week 36 is when they set the schedule out at the start of the season. They leave 2 free midweeks later on in the season specifically for these rearrangements. Actually, last season, game week 36 didn't get used at all because they brought the 34 ones forward. and the little movements around they did in 37, they were able to kind of fit them within the same weeks, because actually 37 is a relatively free midweek. It's just the Europa League final, but you need combos to not hit that. And since Manchester United and Nottingham Forest, which is the Game Week 37 fixture for those two, are both out of the FA Cup, then we know that fixture will stay in 37, because even if Forest make the Europa League final, neither of them or their Game Week 37 opponents can make the FA Cup final. So actually they're not going to cause a clash. So if there's going to be any clash involving Villa making the Europa League final, Villa play Liverpool in Game Week 37. So if Villa make the Europa League final and Villa or Liverpool or both make the FA Cup final, then we'd have a bit of a clash going on over here. So Villa would have a game at the Game Week 37 weekend, but also a game in the Game Week 37 midweek. Or they'd have, a game in the Game Week 37 midweek. So their Game Week 37 fixture caused by a clash from Liverpool, if Villa don't make it, doesn't fit into the midweek. So they'd have to try and fit them around there. So that's where you'd probably see like a small blank of one fixture coming forward into Game Week 36. If teams have gone out early, so if some of these teams have gone out in the UCL last 16 or even the playoff rounds, we saw Man City last year went out to Real Madrid in the UCL playoff rounds, then we might see some doubles. Like we saw Newcastle Palace from the blank game week with the League Cup go into a Champions League midweek last year, a little unexpectedly. So we thought that they'd probably put it into 33, and then they'd put if Palace did make it. Newcastle or Palace make the FA Cup games, then they would push it to 36. But actually, they put it in 32. So that's where Crystal Palace had the back-to-back doubles. I think a few people played assistant manager on Ollie Glasner because they had a double in 32 against Newcastle, and then a double in 33 against Arsenal, because Palace had made Palace had made the FA Cup semi-finals, so that got brought forward to 33. We might see a double in 31 or 32. Actually, one of these games, if they're out before the quarterfinal, I think they'd have to go out pretty early. So if Newcastle or Chelsea got knocked out, or both of them got knocked out in these playoff matches, then we'd know that actually this midweek is free, which would technically still be Game Week 31, even though it's like 3 weeks plus another week later and is right before Game Week 32. I think there was talk that there was a way of like putting one of these last year on the FA Cup quarterfinals, but the Premier League probably don't want to do that. I wouldn't have thought. So there's a small chance of like technically it fits, but there's much better ways for them to move it. So if they've got their decks in a row, then we'll see. But that's why this Arsenal Wolves one might come forward. Any of these could move. We think, to summarize, essentially, and I've talked for a little while about this. To summarize, we think that Arsenal and Man City are pretty likely to make the League Cup final, which will cause a blanking Game Week 31. Arsenal Wolves has a space to come forward into 26. It can't go into 27 because Wolves play Villa on this Friday, and Villa are likely to make the Europa League playoff top 8. Sorry. So Arsenal Wolves has a high chance of coming forward to Game Week 26. We'll know more. Obviously, Arsenal have to win, so we won't have it fully confirmed until Game Week 25. But we think that after some of these European midweeks, they'll then have an idea about whether they want to announce them all together. In terms of the provisional announcement we saw last year. So the provisional announcement last year came here, which was saying if Arsenal win, then their game comes forward. If Liverpool win, their game comes forward. So we might get an announcement before 24, which would then still depend on the semi-final result, but they're looking quite likely. We should have Arsenal Wolves coming forward here, and Man City Palace probably moving to 33, but actually there's a few spaces for it. And then we think that Game Week 34 is going to have 3 or 4 blanks. The Newcastle Arsenal is quite likely, Burnley Man City is quite likely, Brighton Chelsea is quite likely, Liverpool Palace is quite likely, Fulham Villa maybe, a few other outside ones. and they can come forward into 33, or they could go back into 36. Or where there's definitely space, but there might be space to stay within 34 or move it to 35. And there's a very, very small chance of a clash in 37, which would be one blank, which would basically be moving Villa-Liverpool into game week 36, which would be Liverpool or Villa make FA Cup final, Villa make Europa League final, I think. And then actually we've got the Conference League and the Champions League final after the end of the season, but you can't put any fixtures past game week 38. That was just for illustration purposes. So I hope that summarizes everything you need to know. I guess what I can move on to is showing where you might do this in the Solio tool just quickly. So we've actually got most of the fixtures, the game week 31 fixtures, moved already. So you can move these around. These are the fixtures that have clashes. I'll put in info about the 34 ones soon, but for now they're not there. So I can move these around. I can actually show all the fixtures. So this is a quite likely scenario as we see Wolves-Arsenal move from game week 31 to 26. We see Man City Palace move from 31 to 33, and then we might see Arsenal Newcastle move from 34 to 33, for example. Burnley Man City couldn't come into 33 because Man City Palace would be there, so that could go into 36. We might see Brighton Chelsea move into 33 as well. So it just depends what the Premier League wants to do with these TV fixtures, but that would be the kind of the blanks and doubles. So you'd have 2 blanks here, you'd have 3 blanks here, 2 or 3 doubles here. We don't know. I mean, these could all go to 36. We don't actually know which one of these is going to be the bigger one. Last year they went into 33 because they were quite proactive, but they haven't always done that. But that would give us City 2 doubles. Arsenal will get 2 doubles, but one of them is much earlier. So I think you can play around and you can sort of see. And then there's the very small chance of this Villa-Liverpool game coming back into 36 as well. So we might get more than that, but that's essentially the lay of the land for now. So for some people, that might mean they're looking at an early wildcard because they think they can sort their team out now. We will have that provisional announcement potentially, game week 23 or 24, announcing where the fixtures might go from game week 31 if they're able to move, if Wolves-Arsenal is able to come forward. We've already got a pretty good idea of game week 31 blanks, and we'll have that confirmed ahead of game week 25. So actually wildcarding now, setting your team up for being able to roll for the next few period of time if your team's in a bit of a mess, and then deciding whether to free hit 31 or play straight through it using your transfers is something people might look at. So we'll look at what that might mean for people's teams by looking at a wildcard 22. I've loaded Pras's team in here. Or certainly his base team, so we can see what you might want to do if you're trying to get through. I know he's been looking at wildcard 24, seems a bit less keen now that Palmer's potentially an issue. But essentially what I've put in here is I've put like an information split. Wolves-Arsenal double game in 20. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. We've got a Wolves-Arsenal double game in 26 and a Wolves-Arsenal double game in 33, so we don't know which one. When we're wildcarding, we probably won't know which one it's going to be. Obviously there's the chance that it might not be the blank. Newcastle might make a comeback. So Chelsea might make a comeback. But this is sort of what the Solio wildcard might look like for if you're wildcarding this week. So this team has 2 transfers in the bank. So next week we'll have 2. So it has started with a Liverpool player in Szoboszlai for this Burnley fixture, which then is looked to be sold for Bruno Fernandes in game week 24. But it's lining up with Raya, Solio favourite, and not everyone's cup of tea, but someone who might have a double, someone who you can stash quite easily in the blank game week. He's not a bad Arsenal asset, but some people would much prefer to have Gabriel and Timber and Saka or throw Rice in there as well. It's got Joachim Anderson, Vanessa, Gabriel, Chalobah, Virgil, Bosley, Palmer, Foden, Saka, Haaland, Dubravka, Elliot Anderson, Cooper Jr. and Mark Guiu. So it's gone for a cheap front line, Haaland and no one else. Krupi's looking to be playing at the minute. Mark Guiu did play today, but came off quite early. I don't think we're expecting too many minutes for him. And he does block a Chelsea spot, so it might be something you prefer to go for an Ashley Barnes or a Fraser from Wolves or an Obi from Man United or someone like that. sort of dead spot of your choice. But again, yeah, so it has got the sort of alpha midfield three of Palmer, Foden, and Saka, because it feels like it's got the money to spend. It thinks it would rather spend it on that. And then in Game Week 24, it moves Szoboszlai and Foden to Bruno and Tavernier. Bournemouth have actually got a pretty nice fixture run, starting with this Wolves game in Game Week 24. They're quite good early on now. But then you're on to triple Bournemouth. You get Man United, Bruno Fernandes, having seen how Michael Carrick sets them up for a couple of weeks. But also they're playing, I believe it's Arsenal and Man City. Go to the fixtures tab here. Man United play Man City at home and Arsenal away. So 2 fairly tough fixtures for him. So we get to wait a couple of weeks. So that's why it will start with Szoboszlai. I have done another option where we don't start with that, which is maybe a little bit easier to follow. So actually, it just starts with Tavernier straight away. And then it does Foden to Bruno Fernandes in Game Week 24. But the setup's very similar. Otherwise, it's got Dan Ballard in instead of Virgil, which I think allows you being able to move him up to Daniel Munoz or Tarkowski in Game Week 26, depending on which way you want to go with the doubles. A few different options with transfers later on, but essentially that's the kind of structure it likes. I know a lot of people are quite hot on Enzo over Palmer, which I think makes a bit more sense now, having Palmer not been in the squad, but also Rice as well as or over Saka. But if I go to our projections here, I will just reset the projections. I had a few edits for Ekitike. So if I go to, let's say, up to the blank, so Arsenal are going to be higher because we've got the double game week. If I go to midfielders, actually what I can do is I can do Saka, Rice, Enzo, and Palmer, and we can search for them that way. So we can see that we have got Saka, a good sort of point per fixture ahead of Rice at the minute. We've got them on fairly similar minutes, I think. So 80 minutes, or obviously 159 in the double game week. Enzo, we've got more minutes than Palmer. So we've already accounted for Palmer being a sort of more likely sub off. If you think he's going to not start a fixture as well, then that's one you should probably be testing as well. But even with those, we are projecting Saka a full point per game ahead of Rice, and Palmer a full point per game ahead of Enzo. And actually, if we go to the Arsenal penalties here, you can see that we're getting Saka on most of the penalties, but not all of them. Like Gyökeres has got a good chance of them, but you might disagree. If I think Gyökeres is actually going to take them over Saka, I can do that. And then Saka's penalties come right down. Gyökeres isn't always on the pitch. So then we see, bring that in, that Saka's comes down. It's a little bit closer. It's a bit under 1. But I think historically Saka has been a much higher output player. And Rice hasn't traditionally hit DEFCONs as highly as he has recently. We've seen a lot of assists from him from corners and set pieces, which is certainly I wouldn't say anomalously high, but a lot higher than even Arsenal have traditionally. So he has got a lot of attacking returns, but I think that's something that, looking at the longer trends of the data, is something that we're expecting to have an uptick. But actually, and this is an extra 3 million, which is something that people would be concerned about. But I think people who personally are certainly looking through the data, people are saying Rice is better than Saka. I think might perhaps be forgetting how well Saka has played over spells of his career. So we'll see. Like he's not definitely going to keep them up, but he has been very strong. He's still putting up good numbers. So I would, just make sure you're happy that if Saka starts scoring a few goals, you're not panicking about how to get to him, and you are happy with your Rice, your Gabriel, your Timber, all very good options as well. I don't think Saka's anyone who's sort of imperative. Even with the double game week fixture, like Rice is quite high if I come up, and then if I put like Gabriel in, then we've got Gabriel like almost matching Saka actually for this captaincy one, which might be a popular triple captaincy. So I think it has been a while since we've said defenders can be captains, but I think if you're looking at Gabriel and thinking, I might be happy to triple captain him or captain him in game week 26, and I feel like he's not I'm worried about Saka, then as long as Gabriel's fit, looking good, very strong, he's doing really well. I think we would say that's sort of fair enough, which has surprised me. I definitely at the start of the season wouldn't have thought we'd be saying that. And then the equivalent for Parma and Enzo, again, the gap was still fairly strong ahead of him. If I go to our sort of non-penalty goals, we see that Parma's actually putting up a very strong amount of goals. Decent amount of them are penalties. But yeah, I think even with reduced minutes, Parma is so much of a threat on that right-hand side, and can be a very strong option. Enzo, we're a bit less sure if he's going to be further forward or deeper or a bit of both, whereas Parma, right wing or 10, he's probably a bit more prolific and a bit more productive on the right wing. As an FPL asset, not necessarily, just depends what Liam Rosenior wants. Enzo's very good as a 6 and for Chelsea, but not as useful as an FPL asset. So I think Enzo's got the downside of he can play 10 or 6. I'm quite hopeful he plays further forward in the 10. I think people who are looking to save money and are doing it by doing Rice over Saka and Enzo over Parma, I don't think is a bad thing to do. This is all just my opinions now. Need to be bouncing this off Pras. He'd be sense checking me before I say, don't buy Parma, don't buy Saka. Or the opposite, even. So yeah, I think it can be a case for both. Enzo's minutes are probably much more secure than Parma's. I think he missed the odd game, but they looked really poor before that. I know that was under Maresca. He came on at half time against Newcastle, and they were a changed team. But they have got, Reece James is not the most robust, but he's played quite well this season. He can play defensive mid. They've got Caicedo back, who was suspended tonight. If you were watching the Arsenal Chelsea game last night, earlier in the week, whenever you're listening, Caicedo was suspended, so Enzo had to play deeper because they were sort of short on numbers. So I wouldn't necessarily judge him too much on that one. I think he can play further forward as the 10. Andre Santos is someone who looks really good. I think should be getting a few more minutes, hopefully. And João Pedro can play in the 10, but they haven't really got a striker in the same way. Delap's quite good, but maybe they bring Nicholas Jackson back. There is a huge period of uncertainty here, with Chelsea especially, but I think with all the teams in terms of potential new signings. We've got a few new guys coming in, Pascal Gross to Brighton. We've got Conor Gallagher to Spurs. See how that changes things up, or whether that's just more reinforcement in numbers. But essentially, that's my 2 cents on the Chelsea and Arsenal premiums and their, I suppose, budget counterparts, mid-price counterparts, alternatives. I'm sure people will have both. But yeah. So that's the Wildcard 22. I've also done a Wildcard 24, which actually looks pretty similar to the Wildcard 22 currently. So it starts with Bruno because obviously you're 2 weeks in the future. So you can sort of make do with this. You can do Palmer, Bruno, Anderson, Saka. You get a couple of weeks to watch Palmer. I'm not entirely sure what I'd be looking for from Palmer in these next 2 weeks. I think I certainly wanted to see him in the squad today, which would have been a good indicator that he's at least fully fit, even if he's not starting. I think they're fine to rest him, they're fine to rotate, but if he's not going to make the squads, then that's less than ideal. Starts with Tavernier as well. Raya, Gabriel, Ballard, Chalobah, Haaland, Anderson, Creeper Jr., Mount Guiu. It's got Nick Pope. It's actually found some money for Nick Pope on the bench, which actually works quite nicely because actually, if Newcastle do, they'll have that nice fixture in Gameweek 31, hopefully. But yeah, you need to make sure that you have a backup goalkeeper. You need to make sure that you have an alternative to that as well, because actually what I've not put in here is that Newcastle might have that blank if it was a Newcastle-Arsenal League Cup final, for example. If Newcastle can overturn Chelsea and Arsenal can hold on against... Newcastle can overturn Man City and Arsenal can hold on against Chelsea, you'd be keeperless there, Game Week 31. But actually the structure is quite similar. I would say this is a Wildcard 24 planned with Wildcard with sort of Game Week 22's player knowledge. So obviously we've put in a bit more knowledge about where the double game weeks go, but in terms of like who's fit, this is the same projections for Palmer and Saka as we have right now. Whereas in a couple of weeks we might see that Palmer's not been playing, Enzo's been playing further forward. You know, all things can change by then. So I think I would say if you can make do for the next couple of weeks rather than pressing it now, we'll get that info on whether Wolves Arsenal is going to be a double game week in 26. So actually, in terms of an announcement, so you might be able to swap like a Mark Guiu for a Mane here, or a Tolu, or you could even put Jose Sarr as an alternative for a goalkeeper to double, and then you can take Raya out and put Declan Rice in for Anderson or someone like that. But yeah, there's a few different structures. I think for the most part, a lot of the wildcards kind of they pick themselves. A lot of people are going to have very different teams, but if you've got the money to spare, I think Palmer and Saka would be in my team certainly. So yes, hopefully that's covered most people's questions on what they would do on an early wildcard. But I think what you're really looking to do is you're really looking to build up a bank of transfers, because we're still going to get a lot of this information. So if I go back to the Google Sheets here, then we can see actually there's all this info to get from who's actually gonna blank in game week 31, and then the fourth round of the FA Cup, the double itself. That fourth round of the FA Cup is going to give good info on the blanks in 34, about whether you want to free hit in 31 or 34, or whether you're going to save it, or whether even a double in 33 is going to make sense for you for a free hit. So I think, yeah, or where's the bench boost going to make most sense? If a bench boost is looking likely to be, well, even game week 26, you could bench boost with these Arsenal Wolves assets if you wanted to. But I think that's why, yeah, waiting and trying to build up these transfers to know where you're going to take your team in a few weeks' time, rather than using them to try and hop on a few fixture swings here, is going to make most sense in terms of an early wildcard structure. So what we'll do now is we'll go on to a bit of a Q&A from our Discord. So we've got a few questions that I'll quickly cover. I realize I've been talking for quite a while, so I won't keep you. Thank you for listening so far. If you've been listening to me solo rambling for however long. But essentially, yeah, our first question was, I think we've covered this, some of them a little bit, because a few of the questions were about Enzo and Chelsea assets and things like that. So is Cunha to Enzo a solid move? Been flip-flopping over the break. This is from Fred in our Discord. I think if Cunha makes my best 11, then we'll make the move. I like that Enzo frees up funds and should be a good long-term pick. Being in the dark on Rosninia's system makes it seem like a slightly silly move. I don't think that's a silly move at all. I think, it is one you could delay if you want to. You don't have to do it this week. I think Chelsea playing Brentford. But Cunha, if you think Cunha's going to play against Man City, then that's, it's not a great fixture, but it's always one you can do next week or the week after. If you want to just have another game of info. But yeah, I think Enzo's a perfectly fine buy for people this week. I think you've got a wider range of outcomes than we might have done under a known system and a known manager. In terms of, he might be playing more in the 6, or he might be playing further in the 10, but I think he's got enough chance of playing in that 10. He takes penalties when Palmer's not on the pitch, which seems to be like it might be more and more often, depending on how the injury situation is going. So I think like worst case scenario is you've got someone who is playing deeper, getting defcons a little bit more often to slightly make up for the reduced attacking threat. Good for bonus, good for penalties. You hold them through this run of fixtures from 24 to 28, and you can always move them on afterwards if you want to. I think that's a perfectly fine move for the next 5-6 weeks. It's not really like sort of like a short-term punt for like a couple of fixtures. It is a long-term move for 4 or 5 weeks. So I think that's, I think people investing in Chelsea, unless you've got real minutes concerns. I think someone I was looking at was Trevor Chalobah, who has played, I think he started, the only minutes he's missed in the Premier League were when he got sent off, unless I'm mistaken. So he looks good for minutes, and I think he hits defcons quite well. But yeah, there's just a slight inkling that they have lots of centre back options, and maybe he's not Rosenior's preferred centre back, but I'm still quite confident in him. So I think minutes concerns more than system concerns. I think as long as you're accounting for the range of outcomes, that it's not a player who is only good if he's the best version of himself, and if he's a worse version of himself, then he's completely terrible. Like I think Enzo is a player who has a range of outcomes, but he's still quite good in all of them. It's just not as good as what you want. So you have the upside, while still being like, okay, he's fine. Before he's not really a problem for 5-6 weeks. So I'd be careful about sort of overplaying the issue of how good Chelsea are going to be. I think their fixtures are good, and I think managers can come in and they'll change the system up a little bit, but it's not too different. When do you think we'll know if Game Week 26 is reserved for Wolves Arsenal? So that's from Stegman Cometh. That's something I covered just before in terms of, actually I'll jump to it now. We saw that we might get an announcement as soon as Game Week 23 if Arsenal are not guaranteed top 8 in Champions League and they make a provisional announcement. But they're probably more likely to wait for the rest of the Champions League to resolve itself to announce them all together. I think there's a small combination of results that means that Newcastle and Chelsea are guaranteed not top 8 and Arsenal are, in which case they could announce it, a provisional one in 23 already ahead of Game Week 23. But I think we're expecting a provisional announcement in Game Week 23 or 24. Ahead of Game Week 25 would be when we'd know whether the blank does cause this double in terms of have Arsenal made the Champions League, not the Champions League, have Arsenal made the League Cup final. So in the next couple of weeks, it's not too long before we hear that. Monks Boyce asks, why am I your favourite FPL manager? If you're not familiar with Monks Boyce, he's one of our Solio analytics moderators. But he's also in the analytics Discord. He's a big proponent of pushing for very different teams, and he sort of wants risk at the expense of all else. In some regards, he started with Haaland, doing very well. He's top 10k currently. I think he's my favorite manager because he inspires me to be riskier, but also he then makes execution mistakes that remind me that actually just playing how I want to is fine. So that's why Max Boyce is my favorite FPL manager. Fred again asks, who's been your favorite punt you made this season? I don't think I've really had any punts that I've made short term. I tripled up on Newcastle against Burnley in Game Week 15 because I'd saved all my transfers and had to use them. But Gordon was the only one who returned. I think, I guess the answer kind of has to be Keane Lewis Potter on free hit 17, but I'm wary that I bring that up too often just because it went so well with my 111 points, 112 points. 2 goals and a clean sheet from a defender that no one owns was very nice. But yeah, I got Anton Stacks free kick goal in Game Week 5. I picked him on my Game Week 4 wildcard and got that. That was a nice one. I think it's possibly even Ismail Assar in Game Week 1. I went for him over Wirtz and actually spread the funds out a little bit, whereas everyone was going for Wirtz or Watkins. Some people went Ekitike and that went very well for them. But I decided to go without either of those two more expensive ones and spread the money out and went for Ismail Assar, who didn't come off. He got injured quite early on, but I was quite happy with that slightly different structure. What would you need to see? This is from Duple. What would you need to see from Palmer to bring him in? So he's asking about seeing from Palmer tonight. So what I would have liked to have seen from him was being in the squad. If I can do it without pulling my team apart, I can do O'Reilly to Alderete and Cunha to Palmer, but he also has Enzo. Yeah, I think that's a tricky one because Sunderland have a really nice run of fixtures. The Alderete part of this move, and O'Reilly, his minutes aren't looking so good with him playing number 6 in the League Cup yesterday. But then they've got Wolves in Game Week 23. You probably want to move him on after that, so he probably is a sell at some point soon, and Cunha sort of similar now that Bruno's back. So I think as long as that's not putting you in a position where you're really short of transfers, then I think that makes sense to be doing. I think maybe, I think Rosanier said that Palmer should be good for the weekend. So there's still question marks on him, and has he been carrying this injury? But I think there's routes off him if you need to. If he does get another injury again, I think the worst case scenario is these kind of not doing very well, but also not quite getting it wrong enough to be someone you need to sell. So again, also that's moves you could postpone a week if you wanted to. We had a couple of questions from Rave Child and from Deckard about does the optimal wildcard timing depend on your rank? And I think, it depends on your definition of optimal. So actually, the raw optimal maximum projected expected points across the horizon isn't going to change based on your rank. That's purely based on the projected points of the players. And again, it's quite hard to pick apart because we get layers of information coming through a bit at a time. So actually, the best way I find to play it is to kind of be ready for A or B might happen, rather than going, well, I don't know which one's going to happen, so I'll play as if neither of them does, or then react to whichever one does, or aim at A and then just hope B doesn't happen. But if in hindsight that it's gone one way, then actually you can do some big things in terms of like hindsight optimization, looking at, okay, when was the best wildcard timing if I knew all the info all the way to the end of the season. So there is no like definitive, this is the best time to wildcard. If you're talking about in terms of differentiating yourself as much from the field as possible to try and catch up that rank, then I think that can change when it makes sense for you to play your wildcard, in terms of actually if there's a more commonly taken path and a less commonly taken path, then the less commonly taken path is probably the one you should be picking, if all else being equal, because it's going to give you the most difference to a larger group of managers. And if you have a very different team that's just as good, your chance of making up big ground is higher than having a team that's good and very similar to everyone else. So I don't know if that necessarily means Gameweek 24 is the best time to do it, because actually what you can do is I think people think that this Gameweek 30, it might prove to be the case, but people often think like, okay, once we know the doubles and everyone's wildcarding in 32, there's like no chance for going very different. But actually, even last season, we saw people play free hit 33 in a double, or save it for a potential double in 36 or 37, instead of the traditional, like a lot of people played it in free hit 34 in the blank. So you can use your free hit to make the wildcard quite different, and like sort of load up on players from the opposite week that people are free hitting, and make your wildcard quite different. Then what that also lets you do is it lets you see how lucky you've been over the next 8 weeks. Because actually, you might get really lucky without doing anything for the next 7 or 8 weeks. In which case, you get to Gameweek 32 and you go, oh, I've caught up a lot of this. I don't need to do anything too drastic with my wildcard. Or you might not have made up as much ground as you wanted to, in which case you can go, okay, I need to really dial the risk up with this one. This is sort of a Hail Mary. So I often find that playing it later, as long as you know like different ways to do that, you don't always need to go early and go, I'm behind, so I need to make moves now. And often people will try and do that, and you can let those people make the mistakes. Sometimes it does pay off. People, like, I think a few years ago we had a mass sprinkling of doubles in like Gameweek 26, 27, 28, 29. There was just loads of them, and people played a wild card early, and made a big gain on the field. But I think there's gains to be made later on in the season, and you'll also have a firmer idea of how much ground you need to make up, whereas you can play slightly differently for the next 5-10 weeks without needing to play your chip. See how everyone else gets on and catch that up, and then make a decision in 32. So that's not to say you can't wildcard early. If you find a wildcard draft early that you really like, you find one without Haaland in it that is, within 5 to 10 predicted points of the one without Haaland in that you like, then I think that's perfectly fine to try that. as long as you're prepared for the chance that it might not come off. You might make your team worse. You might make your rank worse by trying to make it even better. So now we'll quickly go on to my team just to wrap up. So what I've got planned. So my base team is this. So I've got Raya, Lacroix, Mukiele, Gabriel, Virgil, Foden, Cunha, Anderson, Saka, Szoboszlai, Haaland, and then on the bench Dubravka, Thiago, Collins, and Mark Guiu. I've got 1.3 million in the bank. I've got 5 transfers, so I have to do something. So I have been quite patient with my moves over the last 4 or 5 weeks to build up these 5 transfer bank. And only really taken on sort of the more core parts of the plans. So I've managed to bring in Gabriel. I've managed to finally bring in Foden after all this time. Made some price drops on him. People have been selling him. And I've already held Szoboszlai from quite a while ago. So he was an easy one to hold. Try and, get him against Burnley this week and then probably move him on. So I think that the thing that made sense for me initially was to get onto Parma now. So with a transfer of Cunha and Thiago to Parma and Krupa Jr. Now that we've got a 4.5 likely playing forward, with Bournemouth even having some quite nice fixtures coming up from Gameweek 24 especially. I could go for Mane as well if I think his minutes are quite good. For Wolves, I think I'm a little wary of. We've got Bellegarde and Monetzi coming back from injury quite soon, so we need to see how they line up with those guys. And Mane's playing sort of central midfield, so he's not, he's looked really good. He's a great player, but I think Krupi's maybe one who's more likely to get a bit involved in the goals, even though Mane might have this double game week. But that is a problem later on, where actually maybe it'd be better to have my 4.5 forward playing in game week 31 rather than having a double in game week 26 when my team's quite strong anyway. And then Nathan Collins is someone I can move on. Now that I think Collins and Thiago have both done really well for me over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I did bench Thiago's hat trick, sadly. But Collins has been great. But I think their patch of fixtures is kind of coming to an end now. So actually, if I go to the Brentford's upcoming fixture run, away to Chelsea, home to Forest, away to Villa, away to Newcastle, home to Arsenal. It's not a very nice run. So I think I've got a lot of money tied up in Thiago, so I'm not keen to sell him necessarily. But I think it's fine for me to move him on. I quite like the structure with two forwards. And it lets me get to Foden, Saka, and Palmer. And then in a couple of weeks, I can do this Foden Szoboszlai move from the wildcard. I can do Foden Szoboszlai to Bruno Tavernier. So my team's actually looking quite similar to this wildcard 24, which is why I'm definitely going to be holding off, assuming that I can survive injuries with my transfers. But I've got a good squad to manage that. I've got enough transfers to manage that, and then I can do something like Mukiele to Senesi in Gateway 25. There's also a slightly different route where instead of buying Chalobah, I buy Dan Ballard. And then that allows me to that would be if I wanted to keep Szoboszlai and sell Foden to Bruno, and not do Szoboszlai to Tavernier. Then that would give me the money to be able to do that, and I could do let's say Virgil down to, I think Alderete was coming up, which gave me this sort of triple Sunderland line in 24 that looked quite fun, but and then moved a couple of them on in 25. But I'm not so sure on that, so I need to explore these other routes that don't have Palmer. To see whether I think actually it's still worth going for a Palmer who might not be playing the full 90s, has a small chance of missing a Premier League game. I think once we get to the games that have like a Champions League matches in between, they're going to be quite important for Chelsea. So I could just do Cunha to Bruno, kind of bring that move forward from 24. And instead of doing Cunha to Palmer and then Foden to Bruno, I'll just do Cunha to Bruno. And then do Foden to Palmer in 24 if I still decide I do want Palmer at that point. So it kind of lets me delay the decision, but I think it gives up quite a bit of predicted points over the next couple of weeks. So I'm not sure. I'm quite keen on Palmer still. So I'm going to have to do a bit of thinking about whether I think he is worth gambling on a little bit early. I'm sure there are some other lines where I can do maybe like a Cunha to Enzo now if I think that he's a bit more secure. I think Cunha is probably the one who's going to be going, given that Newcastle are playing Man City and Arsenal, and he'll be off penalties and with Bruno Fernandes back, and yeah, he's the one that probably needs to go, or makes most sense to me to sell. I don't think anyone else in the team is sort of a problem, so to speak. So I'd possibly, if I wanted to, I probably do have the luxury of swapping a Raya to a Timber or a Rice if I really wanted to. But I'm not sure. I still quite like backing Raya and hoping and praying and sort of sticking with them for Raya's sake. But I guess I don't know what other keeper I'd go for. But the team looks strong, and I got 5 transfers, so it's not really a nice problem to have. I think I'm in any issue of running into a big problem, and if one arises, then I've got some transfers to get my way out of it. So we'll see. I think Haaland just makes most sense as captaincy this week. If I look at our projected points, then his highest we've got Szoboszlai, Gakpo, Wirtz, Ekitike. We've still got him reduced minutes, so if we bring him up, he'd be up amongst it. So I think if you want to go for one of these Liverpool attackers against Burnley, then that's perfectly viable. I'll probably just stick with Haaland. I think Szoboszlai's got enough of a downside with potentially playing right back, or he's not really been putting up the numbers that we might have expected from him playing in his position. So I think I'm happy to just go with the safety of Haaland this week and try things out next week. But yes, hopefully that's been interesting and useful, and everything else in between. I hope people haven't missed Pras too much. I know I did. But he did a very good video on the FPL Wire channel on Sunday about his potential look at Wildcard 24. So I'll link that video as well if people are here for checking out Praz's team and what he wants to do. If you have enjoyed it, do let us know. Do give me a comment. I'm still fairly new to content production here, so I'm enjoying the journey. But yeah, it's been good fun. If make sure to check out our Solio analytics tool. We've got free versions for 5 game weeks. Then we've got paid tiers for the premium features. But yeah, we want as many people to be trying out and using it as possible. We've really enjoyed the people who've let us know how it's been going so far. And yes, make sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And good luck for Game Week 22. See you next week.